Members of the G20 are gearing up for this annual gathering, which kicks off in Brazil next week. The fiscus for this particular year centers around social inclusion, global governance reform, and energy transition. Ongoing geopolitical issues as well as trade tensions are high on the agenda too. Economic and legal policy advisor Dr Magalie Masamba joins us in studio for this conversation. Thank you so much for your time, Magalie. It's interesting times as we go into 2024 of G20. The relevance for Africa, in particular South Africa, what is it?
Yeah, I think the G20 is very important. As you are aware, South Africa is taking over the presidency of the G20, literally in the coming, in the near future, taking over from Brazil. And I think the G20 is really important because of what it represents and who the members are. So if you look at the statistics, the G20 represents 85% of the global GDP. If you look at international trade, it represents about 75% of global trade, 60% of the actual physical land mass, global land mass, and 2/3 of the world economy. That means that the discussions that happen at the G20 matter to the world and especially to Africa. And I think having South Africa as the only African country representative, and of course, you may know that the African Union just became a permanent member in 2023. So that's also African representation. But it means a lot to have South Africa as the president of such an important body.
Representation, of course, is vital for the African continent on the global scale of economics, and South Africa taking over the presidency in G20. The significance of that for BRICS especially, as well as Africa on a continental landscape. What should we be looking to there in terms of issues that need to be tackled, but that also speak to locals like you and I?
So I think some of the top issues that South Africa should look at is how do we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and specifically how do we finance achieving those goals? I definitely think, especially with the African Union also as a permanent member, perhaps this is an opportunity to also advocate for the issues that come up in the African Union's Agenda 2063, which also includes issues of international trade, issues of infrastructure, and how do we finance these. I definitely think that South Africa should also be advocating, of course, for more climate finance. So how do we finance mitigation and adaptation? And I think if I could add one more, and of course there's so many more I could add, but I'll add the debt issue. I don't think a discussion about the G20 without discussing sovereign debt at a global level, and especially Africa's sovereign debt, would do justice. Yeah. It's not included.
Let's delve deeper into that debt issue. Many of the African countries are deep in debt. And just as I referenced a short while ago, what S&P Global was saying around the unrest, the post-political unrest in Mozambique, already highlighted as a risk. How does G20 have this conversation with African leaders who in turn would have to knock on the same doors for lending, but at the same time, when we look at the returns, they're not beneficial for Africa?
Absolutely. The debt question is very concerning. If I can just throw a few statistics before I answer your question. If you look at just the increase of interest rate payments, so this is not principal, just interest rate payments of developing countries in general over the past decade. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development notes that I think for over the past decade, developing countries have increased their interest payments by 64%. But if you look at African countries over the past decade, the interest payments have increased by 132%. That sounds astronomical, and it sounds very concerning. And I'll just throw another statistic in very quickly. Yeah. About 57% of Africa's population live in countries that pay more towards debt payments, and especially towards foreign creditors, than they do for pay for or budget for healthcare, education, and all those essential services. So that means the debt question is important to the people of the African continent. It's important for achievement of human rights. It's important for providing social services. Now, the G20 has become very instrumental in the debt conversation. If you look at the conversation immediately after or during, I'll say, the COVID-19 pandemic, the G20 provided the main unified response to the debt problem. So there was the debt service suspension initiative that temporarily suspended the debt of about 48 countries all over the world. And I think 73 countries qualified. However, after that temporary program ended, the G20 implemented a common framework that was supposed to be a more thorough approach to dealing with debt. However, there's many questions on how effective the common framework has been, especially because only 4 African countries are part of that program, and that's Zambia, Ethiopia, Chad, and I believe Ghana. So those are the only 4 countries. So there's other countries that I think do need to talk about their restructuring. Many countries are at high risk of debt distress. Some of them are already in distress. Mozambique is one of them. So the G20 is an important body because of who the members are. However, there's many questions on whether enough is being done. And I think having South Africa as the president opens up a door to continue speaking about the reform of the global financial architecture and specifically how we tackle debt in a fair, equitable, and just manner.
Part of that architecture, speaking of debt, is also going to involve tough conversations that are taking place between countries that essentially there are tensions, be it geopolitics or, you know, the international relations policy of, I'll use an example of the US and South Africa as just an easy example to just draw parallels in terms of the contrast that is there. Those matters are said to be on the table with these leaders. How likely are they to play nice, if I were to put it that way?
Yeah, that's a very complex question. I don't even know if I can really answer that question, especially because South Africa's G20 presidency is only a year. So the question is, what can you achieve in a year? I know the political discussions, and they're not even really political, they're more of trade discussions that do become political, are very complex, especially in the context of AGOA, for example. And we have the complexities of the US's new presidency. And we're yet to know what direction the Trump administration is going to take when it comes to trade, especially with African countries, specifically with South Africa, which is an important trading partner with the US on the continent. So it's a complex one.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a complex one, but I will say I can't comment on playing nice because nice would be how much can they do for us.
Yeah.
So nice is relative,
yeah.
But I can say it's only a year. The question is, what can we achieve in a year?
In politics, nice indeed is relative. As a parting shot on the issues around what we've seen in the work of South Africa being grey-listed, it is an outcome of G20 that we are subsequently grey-listed. Of course, it is meant to be a measure that ensures that there's legal flows of money across the globe. However, in South Africa, it does feel like a bit of a sting, and those conversations too need to take place in terms of how this is meted out to the rest of the globe as well as America. How does that conversation take place?
Yeah, I think the conversation is actually taking place, especially in the context of the debt architecture. One of the big questions is, how do the different stakeholders actually influence countries? And one of the main stakeholders are credit rating agencies, who are actually very powerful and can either, for example, hinder countries that want to potentially restructure their debt, or they might have rules that, you know, in many instances have been seen as quite unfair. And one of the big conversations in the African context is, should we be, you know, developing our own credit rating agencies? And what are the hindrances of doing that? It's not an easy task to develop our own agencies through our African institutions with the assistance of, for example, the African Development Bank and the African Union. So I think these conversations are happening even outside of the G20 context. But within the G20, I think it is an opportunity for South Africa to advocate for a fairer architecture. And I think some of the technicalities should be dealt with by the working groups that are going to be dealing with financial issues.
As a parting shot, it's a new dispensation that is coming in from South Africa, taking over presidency of the G20 to the United States, ushering back in Donald Trump. The outcomes that we are expecting from G20 2024, what are they meant to be at a tangible level, we are in a new normal, particularly for the global dynamics of economics. How much of this should not be a talk show?
I definitely think, in general, it should not be a talk shop. I think we need tangible results, but also should bear in mind it's only a year. And if I can throw in an interesting fact, the next G20 presidency will go to the United States. So that's also a very interesting factor. So I think some of the tangible outcomes that we need is there needs to be further reform of the international financial architecture. Specifically, how do we efficiently, so in terms of speed, how do we provide efficient debt restructuring? How do we provide deep debt restructuring? And how do we create a mechanism that really does work for not just the African continent, but developing countries? Another question that I hope we will be closer to answering is how do we get closer to achieving the SDGs? How do we finance that? How do we fill the climate financing gap? So these are complex questions. I don't know how much of it can be dealt with in a year, but they do need to be dealt with.
We'll be keeping a close eye on that. Thank you so much for your contribution. Dr. Magalie Masamba speaking to us ahead of the G20 Summit that will be kicking off in Brazil next week.